Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. January 27th, 2009. The River Derwent lies calm beneath the early morning light. From the shoreline, nothing appears unusual. Fishing boats move through the harbour. Commuters begin their day. Seagulls circle overhead. But anchored offshore sits a yacht called Four Winds, and something is terribly wrong. The vessel is partially flooded. Its owner is missing. And before the day is over, a routine call for assistance will become the beginning of one of Tasmania's most controversial criminal investigations. A case involving a missing man, a yacht with no witnesses, a murder conviction without a body, and a debate that continues more than 15 years later. This is the story of Bob Chappell, the man who vanished from Four Winds. Before he became the subject of headlines and courtroom arguments, Bob Chappell was known as a scientist. For much of his working life, he was a medical physicist. His career revolved around precision, evidence, and problem-solving. Colleagues described him as intelligent, analytical, and methodical. He was not a man known for recklessness, nor was he someone who sought attention. By the late 2000s, Bob was entering a stage of life many people look forward to: retirement. After decades of work, he was planning for something different: more freedom, more time, more opportunity to enjoy things that he loved. One of those things was sailing. For Bob, the water represented an escape, adventure, a chance to slow down and enjoy life after years of responsibility. And it was through that shared vision of the future that a yacht called Four Winds entered the picture. Bob had been in a long-term relationship with Susan Neill-Fraser for approximately 18 years. Together, they had built a life. They were a couple with plans for the future. Like many couples approaching retirement, they dreamed about what came next: travel, independence, life on the water. Those plans became reality when they bought Four Winds. At 16 metres in length, the yacht was more than a recreational vessel. It represented possibility. A floating home away from home, a retirement dream. A symbol of the life they had hoped to build together. Bringing Four Winds to Tasmania would prove more challenging than expected. During the voyage south from Queensland, Bob experienced health issues, including severe nosebleeds. At times, this affected his ability to operate the vessel, and the journey became difficult. Assistance was required. But eventually, Four Winds arrived in Hobart, and it was moored on the River Derwent. There, among dozens of other vessels, it became part of the local waterfront. For a brief period, life appeared to be moving exactly as planned. The yacht was home. The future seemed secure. And nobody could have imagined that within a short time, Four Winds would become one of the most talked about crime scenes in Australian history. Because in January 2009, everything changed. A man would disappear, a family would be left searching for answers, and a mystery would begin that remains unsolved in the minds of many people to this day. In investigations involving disappearances, detectives often focus on one question before any other. When was the last time the missing person was known to be alive? For Bob Chappell, the answer would lead investigators to the final 48 hours before he vanished from Four Winds. Those 2 days would become some of the most heavily scrutinised hours in Tasmania's criminal history. Every conversation, every sighting, every movement. All examined in an attempt to understand what happened aboard the yacht. January 25, 2009. 2 days before Bob would be reported missing. Four Winds sat at its mooring on the River Derwent, gently moving with the tide. Bob was spending time aboard the yacht. So was Susan Neill-Fraser. Also present that day was Bob's sister Anne Sanchez. At the time, nothing appeared unusual. There were jobs to be done, repairs to consider, conversations about the yacht and the future. The sort of routine activity that comes with owning a large vessel. No one could have known that these ordinary moments would later be dissected in courtrooms and media reports for years to come. During this time, a witness would later report hearing what appeared to be an argument on a yacht in the area. Raised voices. An exchange that stood out enough to be remembered. Exactly what was said remains uncertain, and whether the argument was connected to Four Winds would become a matter of discussion and interpretation. But in a case with so few direct answers, even small observations attracted attention. Investigators would eventually examine every reported sighting and witness account, searching for anything that might help explain what happened next. There were also reports of other individuals being seen around the waterfront during this period. The area surrounding the River Derwent was not isolated. People came and went from nearby marinas. Boats moved through the harbour. Visitors and locals walked along the waterfront. Years later, questions would continue to be raised about whether everyone present in the area had been properly identified and accounted for. Those questions would become part of the broader debate surrounding the case. But on January 25th, none of that was known. The future still appeared ordinary. Bob was alive. Four Winds remained exactly where it belonged. And the events that would change everything were still ahead. January 26th, 2009. Australia Day, a public holiday. Across Hobart, families gathered for barbecues and celebrations. The city carried the relaxed atmosphere that often accompanies a summer long weekend. On the River Derwent, boats dotted the water beneath clear skies. For Bob Chappell, it would be the final day he was confirmed to be alive. During the day, Bob spent time aboard Four Winds. Work continued on the yacht. Maintenance tasks that had become part of preparing the vessel for future adventures. Susan Neill-Fraser also visited the yacht. Their movements that day would later become important to investigators attempting to reconstruct a timeline. At the time, however, there was no reason to believe anything was wrong. No emergency, no distress signal, no indication that the hours ahead would become the subject of a murder investigation. Quick pause here. If you're enjoying these deeper case breakdowns, there's a full extended membership version available through the website. That's where I go beyond the main narrative into structure, timelines, decision points, and the investigative layers that don't always make it into the public cut. It's all linked in the description if you want to go deeper. All right, let's get back into it. As evening approached, Hobart's celebrations began winding down. The bright heat of the day softened into twilight. People returned home. The harbour became quieter. Lights reflected across the darkening water, and Four Winds remained at its mooring, still, silent. At some point during the night, the timeline becomes uncertain. This is where the mystery begins. Investigators know Bob Chappell was alive on January 26th. By the following morning, he was gone. What happened between those 2 points has never been witnessed. No one has ever come forward claiming they saw the exact moment Bob disappeared. No recording exists showing what occurred aboard the Four Winds. No definitive account explains what happened during those missing hours. Instead, investigators were left with fragments, witness observations, physical evidence, statements from people connected to the case. And from those fragments, they would attempt to reconstruct the night's events. Was there an accident? Did Bob fall into the water? Did someone else board the yacht? Did a confrontation occur? Or was something far more deliberate unfolding aboard Four Winds? These questions would shape every stage of the investigation that followed. Because somewhere within those missing hours lay the answer to what happened to Bob Chappell. An answer investigators believed they eventually found. An answer others would continue to challenge. But on the night of January 26, 2009, none of those debates existed yet. There was only darkness, the quiet movement of the river, and a yacht sitting alone on the water. By sunrise, Four Winds would no longer be a retirement dream. It would become a crime scene, and the search for Bob Chappell would begin. January 27th, 2009, the morning after Australia Day. As Hobart slowly came to life, the River Derwent looked much as it always did. Fishing boats moved across the water. Commuters began their day. The city carried on, unaware that one of the most enduring mysteries was already unfolding. Out on the river, something was wrong. Very wrong. Attention was drawn to Four Winds. The yacht appeared to be sitting lower in the water than it should have been. For those familiar with boats, it was immediately concerning. A vessel that had been secure the day before now appears to be taking on water. Emergency services were contacted, and at first there was no reason to suspect a crime. Boats can suffer damage, equipment can fail, accidents happen. The immediate concern was the condition of the yacht itself. But as people approached Four Winds, another question quickly emerged. Where was Bob Chappell? When responders were able to board the yacht, they found a scene that raised more questions than answers. Parts of the yacht showed signs of damage. The interior was not as it should have been. And most importantly, Bob was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of him aboard, no indication that he was sleeping below deck, no explanation for his absence. Bob had simply vanished. At that moment, several possibilities still existed. Perhaps he had had an accident and fallen into the water. Perhaps he'd suffered a medical emergency. Perhaps there was an explanation investigators simply had not discovered yet. But as authorities examined Four Winds more closely, the situation became increasingly unusual. Police began documenting the scene, photographs were taken, evidence was collected. Investigators worked through the yacht, attempting to determine exactly what had happened during the previous night. What they found would ultimately lead the investigation in a very different direction from a simple boating accident. The condition of the vessel attracted immediate attention. Questions arose about the flooding, questions about damage found aboard the yacht, about whether what investigators were seeing could be explained by accident alone. As those questions grew, so did concerns that Bob's disappearance might not have been accidental. Search efforts were launched, police examined the surrounding waters, marine units searched the River Derwent. If Bob had gone overboard, investigators hoped they might find some sign of him. Anything that could explain what had happened. But the search produced no answers. No trace of Bob. No body. No clear explanation. As the hours passed, uncertainty began giving way to suspicion. And suspicion began giving way to something more serious. The investigation was no longer focused solely on finding a missing man. Detectives now faced a different possibility. What if Bob Chappell had not disappeared accidentally? What if a crime had occurred aboard Four Winds? That shift in thinking changed everything. Investigators began looking closely at Bob's final known movements. They examined who had been aboard the yacht, who had seen him, who had spoken with him, and who might know what had happened during the missing hours between the evening of January 26th and the morning of January 27th. As often happens in missing persons investigations, attention naturally turned toward those closest to him. One of those people was Susan Neill-Fraser, Bob's long-term partner. A woman who had shared nearly 2 decades of her life with him. A woman who had been connected to Four Winds. and a woman who would soon find herself at the centre of one of Tasmania's most controversial murder investigations. Susan spoke with investigators. She denied any involvement in Bob's disappearance. She maintained that she loved Bob and wanted answers about what had happened. At that stage, investigators were still attempting to establish facts. But as evidence continued to be gathered, police began developing a theory. A theory that would eventually form the foundation of their case. Investigators came to believe that Bob Chappell had died aboard Four Winds during the night of January 26th. They believed the flooding of the yacht was connected to efforts to conceal what had happened. And they believed the person responsible was someone Bob knew, someone who had access to the vessel, someone who had been part of his life. The challenge facing investigators was enormous. Everything would depend on reconstruction, piecing together evidence, building a timeline, and determining whether the circumstances pointed toward accident, misadventure, or murder. Every damaged section of the yacht mattered. Every witness statement mattered. Every minute of the timeline mattered. Because somewhere within that evidence lay the answer to what happened during Bob Chappell's final hours. Or at least the answer investigators believed they had found. Within days, the investigation had become something else entirely. A homicide investigation. One that would eventually lead to a murder trial despite the absence of a body. One that would divide public opinion for years to come. And one that would force a jury to answer a question that remains controversial to this day. What really happened aboard Four Winds? Investigators spent countless hours examining Four Winds, every compartment, every damaged section, every item left behind. Investigators also focused on what they believed were signs of a violent incident. Forensic examinations were conducted, samples were collected, specialists were brought in to analyse the evidence. But there was still no direct evidence showing exactly what had happened. No witness, no confession, no recovered remains. Only a collection of circumstances that investigators believed pointed in one direction. As the investigation progressed, attention increasingly focused on Susan Neill-Fraser. She had been Bob's partner for nearly 2 decades. She had access to the yacht, and she was among the last known people to have contact with him. Police examined her movements closely. They compared witness accounts, reviewed statements, and analysed what they believed the evidence was telling them. Eventually, detectives reached a conclusion. They believed Susan Neill-Fraser was responsible for Bob's death. But while police felt their theory was becoming stronger, others questioned whether alternative possibilities had been fully explored. Could somebody else have boarded Four Winds? Could an unknown person have become involved? Could investigators have misunderstood aspects of the physical evidence? These questions would become central to the arguments made by Sue's supporters in years that followed. At the time, however, detectives remained focused on the case they were building. And piece by piece, they continued gathering evidence. Witnesses were interviewed. Some described activity around the marina. Others spoke about the relationships and circumstances surrounding Bob and Susan. Each account was assessed for reliability. Each statement compared against the growing timeline. As in many complex investigations, not every witness agreed. Not every memory was identical, and not every detail fit neatly into place. Investigators were left with the difficult task of determining which pieces were significant and which pieces were not. As months passed, police became convinced they had enough evidence to proceed. The investigation had started with a missing man. It had evolved into a homicide inquiry, and now it was moving toward a murder prosecution. The challenge facing prosecutors was obvious. They would be asking a jury to convict someone of murder despite the absence of a body. That is rare, but it's not unprecedented. Australian courts have previously heard so-called no-body murder cases. The law does not require a body to prove homicide. What it requires is evidence capable of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The question was whether the evidence from Four Winds would meet that standard. For investigators, the answer was yes. They believed the yacht told a story of violence, a story of concealment, and a story that pointed directly to Susan Neill-Fraser. The defence would later argue that investigators had interpreted the evidence through the lens of a single theory, that uncertainty remained, that important questions had not been answered, and that suspicion was not the same thing as proof. Those competing interpretations would soon collide in court. Because the investigation was ending, the legal battle was about to begin, and 12 jurors would ultimately be asked to decide whether the evidence revealed the truth or merely one possible version of it. The disappearance of Bob Chappell had already become one of Tasmania's most significant criminal investigations. Now, it was about to become one of Tasmania's most controversial murder trials. The case seemed to contain all the elements of a mystery. A respected scientist, a missing man, a yacht found partially submerged. No body. The prosecution's case centred on a straightforward argument. Bob Chappell was dead. He had been killed aboard Four Winds. His body had been removed from the yacht, and Susan Neill-Fraser was responsible. Prosecutors argued that while no single piece of evidence proved their case on its own, the combined weight of the evidence painted a clear picture. They asked the jury to look at the circumstances as a whole: the condition of the yacht, the flooding, the timeline, the witness evidence, the forensic findings, and Susan's actions before and after Bob's disappearance. According to the Crown, when all those pieces were placed together, they pointed to one conclusion: murder. Quick pause here. If you're enjoying these deeper case breakdowns, there's a full extended membership version available through the website. That's where I go beyond the main narrative into structure, timelines, decision points, and the investigative layers that don't always make it into the public cut. It's all linked in the description if you want to go deeper. All right, let's get back into it. The prosecution acknowledged that there were challenges, that there was no confession, no eyewitness, and no recovered body. But they argued those absences did not prevent the jury from reaching a verdict. The law did not require direct evidence if the circumstantial evidence was strong enough. Their position was that Bob Chappell had not simply vanished. Something had happened aboard the Four Winds, and Susan Neill-Fraser was the person responsible. The defence presented a very different picture. Their argument focused on uncertainty, not what investigators believed, but what could actually be proven. Defence lawyers challenged aspects of the prosecution's reconstruction of events. They argued that assumptions had been made, that important questions remained unanswered, and that investigators had become too focused on a single suspect. The defence repeatedly returned to one unavoidable fact. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to Bob Chappell. No one had witnessed his death. No one had discovered his remains. No one could explain every movement that occurred aboard Four Winds during those missing hours. According to the defence, those unanswered questions created reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, witness after witness entered the courtroom. Police investigators, forensic experts, civilian witnesses, family members. Each provided a piece of the puzzle. Some evidence appeared straightforward. Other evidence became the subject of intense disagreement. Lawyers challenged recollections, questioned timelines, examined inconsistencies, and scrutinised forensic interpretations. For the jury, the task was not easy. Unlike many murder cases, there was no single dramatic piece of evidence, no surveillance footage, no confession, no eyewitness account of violence. Instead, jurors were asked to assess a large collection of facts and determine what story those facts told. As the trial progressed, the absence of Bob Chappell remained ever present. His disappearance was at the centre of every argument. The prosecution argued that the absence itself was part of the crime, that Bob's body had been deliberately concealed. The defence argued that the absence made certainty impossible, that nobody could truly know what had happened without finding him. The jury was left to consider both perspectives. Weeks of evidence eventually came to an end. Closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the evidence collectively. The defence urged them to focus on the unanswered questions. Then the case was placed in the hands of 12 ordinary people. 12 jurors who carried the responsibility of determining whether Susan Neill-Fraser was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. After considering the evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Susan Neill-Fraser was found guilty of the murder of Bob Chappell. The decision marked the end of the trial, but it did not bring an end to the controversy. For supporters of the prosecution, the verdict represented justice. They believed the evidence had revealed what happened aboard Four Winds. They believed the jury had carefully considered the facts and reached the correct conclusion. But for others, the verdict raised concerns. Questions about the investigation, questions about the evidence, questions about whether every possibility had been properly explored. Those questions would not disappear after the verdict was delivered. In many ways, they were only the beginning. The legal battle inside the courtroom was over, but outside the courtroom, a new battle was beginning. A battle over interpretation, a battle over evidence, and a battle over whether the conviction truly resolved the mystery of what happened to Bob Chappell. Because while the jury had delivered its answer, one fact remained unchanged. Bob Chappell had never been found. And that absence would continue to shape everything that followed, including years of appeals, fresh arguments, and ongoing public debate. In the years that followed, Susan Neill-Fraser maintained her innocence. Her supporters argued that the conviction was unsafe. They questioned aspects of the police investigation. They challenged parts of the forensic evidence. And they continued searching for information that might support an alternative explanation for what happened to Bob Four Winds. The case began attracting increasing public attention. Documentaries were produced. Journalists revisited the evidence. Legal commentators discussed the trial, and true crime audiences became fascinated by a mystery that seemed to offer no simple answers. The central question remained the same. Had the right person been convicted? The legal system would be asked that question repeatedly. Appeals were lodged, arguments were presented. Judges reviewed the evidence and legal submissions. As happens in many controversial cases, supporters and critics often viewed the same material very differently. Some believed the evidence overwhelmingly supported the verdict. Others believed significant doubts remained. Yet despite the challenges that were brought before the courts, the conviction continued to stand. The legal conclusion remained unchanged. Susan Neill-Fraser remained convicted of Bob Chappell's murder. One development, however, would become a major focus of public discussion: DNA. Years after the original investigation, questions emerged about DNA evidence found aboard Four Winds. Particular attention centred on DNA linked to a young woman who had been in the waterfront area around the time of Bob's disappearance. The existence of that DNA raised new questions. How had it come to be on board the yacht? What significance did it have? And should it have altered the way investigators viewed the case? For supporters of Susan Neill-Fraser, the DNA became one of the most important issues in the entire investigation. They argued it suggested alternative possibilities that had not been fully explored. Others disagreed, arguing that the DNA did not fundamentally alter the broader evidence that had led to the conviction. As with so many aspects of the Four Winds case, interpretation became the centre of the debate. The controversy surrounding the DNA evidence eventually became part of further legal proceedings. Witnesses were examined, arguments were made. Experts offered differing perspectives. Once again, the courts were asked to consider whether new information undermined confidence in the original verdict, and once again, strong opinions emerged on both sides. Some saw the developments as evidence that important questions remained unanswered. Others saw them as insufficient to overturn the findings reached by the juries. What made the Four Winds case unusual was not simply the legal arguments. It was the persistence of public interest. More than a decade after Bob Chappell disappeared, people were still debating the same fundamental questions. What happened aboard the yacht? Was the investigation correct? Could there be other explanations? The absence of definitive answers allowed those questions to survive long after the trial had ended. And because Bob's body has never been found, there remained a gap at the centre of the story. A missing piece that many people feel prevented complete certainty. The case gradually became larger than the trial itself. It became a discussion about circumstantial evidence, about how criminal investigations are concluded, about the standard of proof required in a murder case, and about whether it's possible for reasonable people to examine the same evidence and reach very different conclusions. Legal experts frequently point out that criminal courts are not asked to eliminate every conceivable doubt. They are asked to determine whether guilt has been proven beyond reasonable doubt. For the jury in Susan Neill-Fraser's trial, the answer was yes. For some observers, however, the debate never ended. More than 15 years have passed since Bob Chappell disappeared from Four Winds. The River Derwent still flows through Hobart. Boats still cross its waters. The city continues much as it did before January 2009. But the questions left behind by the disappearance of Bob Chappell have never completely faded. For many people, the case remains one of Australia's most fascinating criminal mysteries. Not because there was no investigation, not because there was no trial, and not because there was no verdict, but because even after all of those things, uncertainty remains. At the centre of the story is a simple fact. Bob Chappell vanished. A respected scientist, a father, a brother, a partner, a man approaching retirement and looking forward to the future. Suddenly, he was gone. His disappearance changed the lives of everyone who knew him. For his family, it created a loss unlike most others. There was no final goodbye, no grave to visit, no confirmed account of his final moments. Only absence and unanswered questions stretching across years. For Susan Neill-Fraser, the case would become inescapable. Her conviction transformed her life. Years of imprisonment, years of legal battles, years of public scrutiny. Supporters continue to argue that she had been wrongfully convicted. Others remained convinced that the jury had reached the correct decision. The disagreement has endured for more than a decade, and there is little sign of it disappearing anytime soon. Because the case touches on something larger than one verdict. It raises questions about how justice is determined when direct evidence is limited, how juries evaluate circumstantial cases, how certainty is measured when some of the most important facts remain unknown. Over time, the Four Winds case has become part of the Australian true crime landscape. It has been examined in books, discussed in documentaries, analysed in podcasts, debated on online forums. and revisited by journalists seeking to understand how a case with so many unanswered questions resulted in such a definitive legal outcome. Each retelling tends to focus on different details, different evidence, different interpretations. Yet every version returns to the same central mystery. What happened aboard Four Winds on the night of January 26, 2009? The missing man whose final movements remain the subject of debates. For some, the evidence points clearly in one direction. For others, the unanswered questions remain too significant to ignore. The courts have delivered their conclusion. Public opinion remains divided. And between those two realities sits the enduring mystery of Four Winds. His family never received that certainty that so many families seek. And the waters of River Derwent have never revealed the answer to the question that has lingered since January 2009. What happened to Bob Chappell? Perhaps one day new evidence will emerge. Perhaps a discovery will finally provide the missing piece. Or perhaps the mystery will remain exactly where it has been for more than 15 years, suspended between what is known and what is unknowable, between certainty and doubt, between a legal conclusion and a lingering question. Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.